Okay, well, thanks for having me. I've been very impressed with the diverse range of talks we've had since Tuesday. I am speaking on behalf of my group. Daniel, it's me. Sonia, she's the PI, and Bryan, he's one of our new master students. And today we're going to be talking about cumulus entrainment and convective clouds and storms. And I know there's a diverse background of audience, so I will introduce entrainment and why it is critical for this field. So cumulus clouds are typically formed on rising currents of air, this buoyant air that rises, and on the edges of these currents you have instabilities, little eddies. Now these eddies act to draw in the drier, cooler environmental air into this warm air current. And this has two main effects. One, you are reducing the buoyancy of the cloud, therefore limiting the maximum updraft speed and the maximum depth of a cloud. And two, you're also evaporating large amounts of condensate such as liquid water or ice. That's crucial for the development of precipitation. And so, in effect, in other words, what you're doing is diluting the cloud with environmental air, much like you would dilute a salt solution by just dumping in more water. And so, it's important to understand entrainment because the rate at which these clouds entrain can influence storms, clouds, in the short term and over a long time period. It can influence weather and the climate. And so this is crucial to understand entrainment, such for improving forecasts of storms, improving prediction of how much rain may fall out of a cloud, and also to maybe eliminate some of the biases we find in larger scale coarser models, such as climate models. And so how do we calculate entrainment? Well, mathematically, it's quite simple. The net entrainment into a cloud, oh my goodness. The net entrainment to a cloud can be summed as these two terms, a rate of change of a cloudy volume, and a second term, the net mass flux into a cloudy volume. So mathematically, not that hard. But computationally, it's a little tricky, especially this first term here, the rate of change in a cloudy volume. Now, imagine a cloud being resolved on a grid. Now, the edge of this cloud moves in time. But on a grid, the cloud edge may jump maybe 50 meters, 100 meters, depending on your grid point spacing. And so we can't get an accurate rate of change of the cloudy volume if the edge jumps so much. And so I followed some work by Jordan Dahl and Philip Austin where they actually used some decomposition method to decompose a grid cell into 48 tetrahedrons. And then you can actually calculate or interpolate where the edge of this cloud is in subgrid scale space. And so we calculate actually where the edge of this cloud would be inside each of these tetrahedrons. And then you have to even divide this tetrahedron into sub-tetrahedrons. And this can get kind of a big headache computationally, especially because each of these tetrahedrons have different orientations. And computationally, it was quite a challenge for a programmer like me who was a novice when he entered graduate school. So, after we implemented this code, we started to try to learn some things about entrainment, or what can influence rates of entrainment. And so we looked at a single cloud simulation in the past, and what we found was that, okay, in some clouds you may have a whole train of thermals, such as, this could be problematic, such as thermals in these boxes here rising up through the depth of the cloud. And these thermals are vehicles of entrainment. We actually found in this previous work that the strongest entrainment occurred at the rear of each of these thermals. The strongest entrainment rate. That means at the rear of these thermals, you're bringing in large amounts of mass quite quickly into the cloud. But we also found out something else. We found out that these thermals can help each other. The first thermal will rise, and it will entrain dry environmental air. But in its wake, it would leave moistened air for its siblings, the next thermals in line, to ingest. And this air that the siblings are ingesting it's not as dry. It's quite humid, and this actually protects the cloud from being diluted. And so this can lead to a situation where there may be more convective variability if you can have situations where there's successive thermals. But there's also other questions we had. Previous allocations before blue waters really limited us to just looking at single cloud simulations at the scales that we wanted to look at. But nature doesn't always have just single, nice, neat, individual clouds. They're often organized as part of a system. It wouldn't be realistic just to treat clouds as an isolated entity. In real life, we see clouds developing sometimes quite closely together in the environment. And so this brought us some questions. What could be the influences of these neighboring clouds on entrainment? Just like there are influences of neighboring thermals on entrainment, maybe there's other influences as well when we take into account other clouds. So the questions are, can neighboring clouds mutually change the rate of entrainment or change the moisture characteristics of the entrained air? And are there any significant changes in the cloud's microphysics or dynamics as a result? So for this talk and all the results we're going to show further, we're using George Bryan's CM1 model. This is a coarse-grained parallelization form of model, and we're using it in a pure MPI mode. It's designed to scale to tens of thousands of processors before you start running into some computational efficiency issues. It has an RK3 time integration, so we kind of avoid some of the baggage associated with second-order centered in time differencing schemes. And it's got some fifth and sixth order advection schemes for nice computational efficiency. We use NSSL or Moser double moment microphysics, which is a nice upgrade from single moment microphysics, where we only predicted the mass of cloud properties, such as the mass of cloud water or the mass of rain. Now we can also predict the concentration per unit volume of some of these cloud particles. And there's an energy conserving form of equations, which is nice since we're talking about physics. We like to conserve energy. For our entrainment calculations, I haven't ported the code to CM1 to run it online. On a previous model, I had coded it up so it worked in parallel on MPI, but we haven't done that yet for CM1, so we use these entrainment calculations offline, and that requires a lot of frequent data output. And so typically every 3 seconds, we need a fast file system. Luckily, the scratch file system, Blue Waters, is quite fast and helps us out a lot. So this animation, as it turns out, doesn't work on this computer. But anyway, what I'm going to show you when I switch to the web browser is that we're simulating basically an organized line of convection. We're simulating multiple clouds growing along a line, and we're going to control the spacing of these clouds along the line, and then take some entrainment calculations to see if the spacing, the proximity of these neighboring clouds influence the entrainment at all. So I can just do this real quick without breaking anything. Oh good, we're near the beginning of the simulation. Oh, it's not showing, never mind. Okay, well that won't work, unfortunately. Anyway, just to envision what you would see young thermals rising up at some distance, and then these clouds start to form more and more, and you'll see multiple thermals with multiple trajectories, leading to quite a bit of convective variability. That's unfortunate that that animation wouldn't show. Okay, so we experimented with different spacings of these clouds. We varied the spacing from 9 kilometers between the centers of each cloud, and we brought it down all the way to 5 kilometers. If we brought the clouds any closer together, it would just be one big merged cloud, and we wouldn't really be able to distinguish clouds from one another. And so we looked at the maximum surface rainfall over any grid point. We noticed that the clouds further spaced apart kind of had a head start when it came to creating rain, but then they were soon overtaken by the clouds that were closer together, and they produced, in one case, the 5 kilometer case, nearly 3 times as much as rain. But when we looked at the entrainment rates across these runs, we noticed that there was very little difference between these rates, except near cloud top, but that was only due to different arrival times of the cloud top between the runs. And so this was not a result we kind of expected. We thought maybe the rates would be different across each run. And so we looked a little closer. We looked at the properties of the entrained air across each run. And so what we do is we bin the properties of every grid point that's entraining into a probability density function. And so we have different types of functions being plotted for humidity, cloud water, buoyancy of the air, and we also have it for the entrained air, stuff going into the cloud or clouds, detrained air, stuff coming out of the clouds, and also a PDF for even what's inside the clouds. And so what we notice, across the runs, let's say for this example, 5 kilometer spacing at the top and 9 kilometer spacing at the bottom, there's no significant difference between the two. The characteristics of the entrained air really did not vary with the distance between the clouds. That would say, to answer my question, is entrainment affected by neighboring clouds? Unfortunately, no. We haven't found that. We haven't found anything to suggest that yet, so it's a bit of a null hypothesis. That's also a good thing to know, that for the cumulus parameterization field, that maybe you don't have to worry so much about convective organization and entrainment rates. One doesn't really mess with the other. Okay. However, last thing, what we did notice, though, was that we have a bit of Darwinism as we bring these clouds closer together. When the clouds are further apart, the mean convergence, horizontal convergence below each cloud, it's approximately the same. But when you bring these clouds closer together, you get more variability than mean convergence. What happens is that some clouds start to fight for the inflow, and they win over other clouds. And so you get some winners, such as cloud 4 here, and you get some losers, such as its neighbor, cloud 5. And this leads to convective variability, leading to differences in the convective rainfall amounts, and that's ultimately just more important than differences in entrainment. Okay, moving on to personally my advisor's work. There's this famous quote that a lot of you may recognize. Big worlds have little worlds which feed on their velocity, and little worlds have lesser worlds, and so on to viscosity. So my advisor asked this question: what is the minimum size of a whirl that would contribute to cloud dilution? At some point, an eddy is going to be so small that it's not going to contribute that much to diluting the cloud. We want to find that lower limit. And so she's done experiments where she does the single cloud simulation, but she's varying the grid point spacing from 100 meters all the way down to 10. And you can see definitely, this is not a photorealistic rendering of a cloud, but there's definitely more and more eddies being resolved. So, is there any kind of convergence where we see the entrainment rates and the dilution start to reach some kind of converging point when we decrease the grid point spacing? Well, the entrainment rates, they converge kind of slowly. You can see we still see differences as we decrease the grid point spacing. These little eddies are still contributing to the overall entrainment rate. So slowly converging. But what about the dilution? When we look at the dilution, let's take this plot here where we look at the percentage of the cloud that is above 80% of its maximum liquid water content that's allowed. We see that as we decrease the grid point spacing, that we get quick convergence below 20 meters. We get 15 meters and 10 meters. When we get to eddies of this size, the cloud is diluting, and going any lower is not going to result in any more dilution of the cloud. So maybe 15 meters could be the minimum eddy size that's necessary to resolve in simulations if you want to get the liquid water content of these clouds correct. But then, is that universal? Probably not. It probably depends on the scale of the system. And so Bryan, our new master's student, he's working on looking at entrainment calculations and supercell simulations. And he's going to be, hopefully we'll get some results together and share with you guys soon. But what we are noticing is that the entrainment rates are sometimes almost an order of magnitude larger than those in small cumulus clouds, which is kind of expected. There's more very powerful eddies in these clouds. Okay, Other things for future work, we do want to introduce parallel NetCDF or HDF5 for CM1 to resolve some scaling issues, and also, maybe not for me, but maybe a postdoc after I leave, integrate my paralleled entrainment codes into CM1. Okay. And I'd like to acknowledge George Bryan for letting us use his model, the Blue Water Project, of course. Thanks for having me. And also some of the National Science Foundation grant, which also supported some of our research. Thank you.